How many times a day do you Google it? The other day, I was watching Forrest Gump with my daughter, and she turned to me at one point and said, "What's the deal with Watergate?" I wasn't so sure. So I Googled it. I wondered if my symptoms were COVID, so I Googled it. Turns out they were. I wondered when the Beatles broke up, so I Googled it, 1970. And when my Swedish sister-in-law started talking about a Cobra phone, I thought, what the heck is a Cobra phone? So I Googled it. And yes, I promise, that is a phone. When I think about how many times a day I Google it, it's astounding. Googling it is definitely a big part of my everyday life. And I bet it's part of yours too. Well, I'm here today because I've turned a different noun into a verb, and I'm convinced that we need to do it as often as we Google it. What noun am I talking about? Compassion. In my heart of hearts, I truly believe that if we compassion it as often as we Google it, we will not only heal ourselves, but we will solve the problems of the world. But we've got to start compassioning it now. Why so urgently? Well, I don't want to bum you out, but we are facing some big issues these days. We're still dealing with a global pandemic. We've got political polarization. Our systems perpetuate racism and sexism. We've got high rates of loneliness and depression. There's a war in Ukraine. And of course, we can't forget about the climate crisis. We've got to start caring for each other and the other species on this planet. Now is the time to compassionate. We really can't wait any longer. So let me back up a little bit and tell you about how compassionate came to be. This is a picture of me with my daughter Hannah back in 2008. And even though I look really smiley and happy in this picture, I was going through the most difficult time of my life. I was facing a heart-wrenching divorce. I couldn't eat or sleep. I was depressed and anxious. I was looking for work, and in 2008, there was a recession, so there were no jobs. And I spent a lot of time on the couch watching daytime television while my daughter napped. Fortunately for me, I caught an Ellen episode that changed the course of my life. She was talking to Wayne Dyer, and Wayne Dyer was talking about compassion. He said compassion is the most important lesson to teach our children. If we would teach our children compassion, we could solve the problems of the world. And I had never really thought about how powerful compassion was until I heard him say that, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. That very evening, the word compassionate turned into two words, compassionate. And I thought, oh, that's super cool. It's like, Google it, or just do it. It made compassion a verb. So of course I Googled it to see if anyone had thought of it, and if they hadn't done anything with it. So I started the process for trademarking bumper stickers, thinking this would be a super cool bumper sticker. Well, I postponed that trademark for 3 years because it took me about that long to get my life back on track. In the meantime, I began to compassionate in my everyday life. So when my boss was kind of cranky, I would compassionate and think, he must just be having a tough time at home. I'm not going to take it personally. I was in sales, and when my clients seemed really busy or stressed, I let go of my agenda and compassioned it and did my best to support them. I even compassioned it with my ex. I can't say I always did, but when I did, things went a lot more smoothly. I found over those 3 years that this simple two-word phrase had profoundly changed my life. And I felt this great sense of urgency to share this with the world. So I started making stickers, bumper stickers, and handing them out. That quickly turned into t-shirts because I thought maybe we could be like the next Life is Good. But deep down inside, I was thinking, you know what, this is more than just a brand. Compassionate needs to be a movement. I was telling my good friend Sherry about this, and she said, if you want to start a movement, you probably need to sell something cheaper than a $30 organic cotton t-shirt. What about a wristband? And I was like, those are lame. I totally shot down her idea. And then that evening, I thought, I wonder if I could find a wristband that's two-sided so you could flip it from one side to the other when you compassion it. And voila, the compassionate wristband was born. Long story short, the wristband took off. Someone sent their extra wristband to a YouTuber out of England named Carrie Hope Fletcher. She did a little thing on her YouTube channel for her hundreds of thousands of fans. And literally overnight, Compassionate became a global movement. From homes in Nepal, to villages in Liberia, to teenagers in Argentina, Compassionate was helping people make compassion a priority in their everyday lives. In the meantime, I got pretty obsessed with compassion, and I found out that Stanford had a Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, and they had developed an 8-week course to help people cultivate compassion for themselves and all others, and they were looking for teachers. I fortunately got in that very first group that was trained to teach that course, Compassion Cultivation Training, and I've been teaching since 2013. So for the past 9 years, I've taught compassion to thousands of people around the world of all walks of life, from inmates in a maximum security prison, to elementary schools, to big tech leaders, to college students. And every time I teach and speak, I always encourage my audiences, and this now includes you, to compassion it every day. But if I'm asking you to compassion it, I probably need to tell you a little bit about what compassion is first. But I'd like to start with what compassion isn't. Guys, compassion is not cute. It's not soft and fluffy. Compassion takes courage and strength. Compassion does not mean you're a doormat. People don't walk all over you. Compassion doesn't mean that you're just feeling other people's pain all the time. Compassion does not mean that you're fixing every problem. In fact, compassion takes humility. Compassion is a response to suffering. You notice someone suffering, you connect to that suffering, and then you have the willingness to do something to alleviate that suffering. I do want to share with you a few things that you need to know about compassion by the end of this talk, okay? So 3 points I want you to remember. And the first one is, you have to face suffering if you're compassionate. You can't run away from it, you can't pretend you don't see it, and you don't get overwhelmed by it. Now keep in mind, I'm using an expansive definition of suffering here, okay? Suffering is not always something tragic or obvious. Oftentimes, suffering is something you can't see. If you're worried, you're suffering. My teachers taught me that suffering is when you want something you can't get, or you get something you don't want, which means most of us are suffering most of the time, okay? So, point number 1, you have to face suffering. Point number 2, you need to know that everyone deserves compassion. Yeah, it's easy to have compassion for someone that you like or for someone like you, but what about that annoying classmate or coworker? What about the person who views the world differently than you? All right, the third point I want you to remember is that you can't compassion it if you don't self-compassion it. That means you need to set boundaries, know your capacity, and listen to your body. Be kind to yourself. So now you're experts in compassion, right? Everybody? We're good? Great, because now I want to share with you a few stories of compassioning it that I've heard over the years to inspire you. And the first story is actually my own. I used to be so hard on myself for every little mistake I made. Now I self-compassionate and remember that I'm human. I've changed my inner critic into an inner coach, It's encouraging and supportive. This has made my life so much better. Another story comes from the East Coast. A high schooler wrote to me and shared that she and her family had been wearing the wristbands for quite some time, and hers inspired her to befriend a boy at school who didn't have many friends. Well, he eventually confided in her that he had plans to bring guns to school. She reported it to the authorities, and they found guns in his possession and were able to stop him before he harmed himself and others. This story comes from the maximum security prison outside of San Diego, Donovan Prison. Inmates there participated in our 30-day Compassionate Challenge. We made special paper wristbands for them, and they wrote reflections each week about their experiences. One inmate wrote that he was in an altercation on the yard, and there was a fist in his face. He said, "If it were the old me, that would have ended badly." Instead, he extended his hand, and they shook hands. That might seem like a cliche story to you, but you all have to remember, this is prison. Things like that don't happen very often. The third story is extra special to me because I'm a graduate at the University of North Carolina. And y'all, did you see the big game last night against Duke? Anyway, it was huge. Speaking of Duke, student athletes from Duke and UNC partnered together during ESPN's Rivalry Week to promote compassion and sportsmanship in their local community. We made a special wristband for them. This was the idea of my friend Dana. It was Carolina blue on one side and Duke blue on the other. So if you were a Carolina student athlete, you would start with the Duke blue side out and as quickly as possible do your compassionate act so that you could flip it to the Carolina blue side. So now that I've shared with you some individual stories of compassioning it, I'd like for us to take a minute to zoom out. At the beginning of this talk, I made a bold statement. I said that if we compassioned it, we would solve the problems of the world. That might seem unrealistic to you, but it's not to me. If you step back, you can see how compassion has the power to influence our greater systems and institutions. For a moment, consider what might happen if our police departments compassioned it. What if our prisons and jails compassioned it? What if our school districts compassioned it? What would happen if our politicians compassioned it? When we center compassion in our classrooms, workplaces, courtrooms, city halls, and yes, in our own lives, we will solve the problems of the world. Now, you know I'm going to end this talk by asking you to compassionate, right? Spoiler alert. But I do want to set you up for success. So I'm going to have you do a brief exercise that helps you connect to the people here, because when we are connected, it's easier to be compassionate. So briefly, and I know this is going to seem awkward, I invite you to take a moment and look around at the faces in this room. Silently look around at who's here. And as you do this, pick out a face of someone you don't know. And no need to make eye contact. And once you have that face, you can turn around and face me. And now you can close your eyes or cast your gaze down and bring this person to mind. And consider that even though you know nothing about this person, and they're probably not like you in a whole lot of ways, they're also just like you in a few ways. Just like you, this person wants to be happy and lead a meaningful life. Just like you, this person wants to be loved and appreciated. Just like you, this person worries, stresses out. This person might even be going through something challenging right now. And in your mind, say silently to this person, "May you be free from worries and struggles. May you feel appreciated and loved." And notice how you feel. Notice if you feel connected to this person. Notice if you wish them well. And now, keeping your eyes closed, consider what it would be like if we did that exercise with everyone on the planet. It wouldn't matter which face you chose. You would feel connected to them too. And now, still with your eyes closed, for a moment recognize that just as you were sending well wishes to someone else, it's very likely that someone was sending well wishes to you. Notice how that feels. Okay, now from this place of warmth and connection, I invite you to open your eyes, because now it's time to compassionate. And I'm not kidding when I say you can do this as often as you Google it. You can compassionate when your professor is grumpy and just think, you know what, she's having a hard day. I'll be extra nice to her. Compassionate at lunch and choose plant-based foods that don't harm the planet. Compassionate when your best friend is telling you issues about their boyfriend. No need to give advice. Just listen and be present. Compassionate on the freeway when someone cuts you off. Remember, maybe they're just in a hurry or they just didn't see you. Compassionate when you and your parents aren't seeing eye to eye. Recognize that they may not know you as well as they did when you lived at their house, and that might be hard for them. Compassionate when you pass by someone experiencing homelessness. Realize you know nothing about this person, and therefore you shouldn't judge them. Instead, recognize their humanity and feel for them. Compassionate when you encounter someone whose political views are not the same as yours. Realize they are a product of their environment. Be curious, listen. And if you're connecting over social media, remember that there's a person behind that screen. Self-compassionate when you're feeling lonely or depressed. Remember you're not alone, and then please reach out and ask for support. The list could go on, but you get it, right? It's pretty simple. Just compassionate. You need it, your friends need it, our society needs it, the world needs it, and frankly, the survival of humanity depends on it. Please, just compassionate. Thank you.